All right, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome. I think we'll get started here. And I know that there are more tuning in. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for making the time to join us here today. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO at the Stimson Center. You know, one of the great benefits of this job is having the opportunity not just to study some of the most pressing global challenges that we face as a planet, but to truly learn from a group of world-class experts in their field. And today, we have assembled just such a group to examine the Biden administration's North Korea policy through the lens of three critical regional actors: Japan, South Korea, and China. I think we can all agree that for the past 4 years, U.S. relations with North Korea have been on an unending will they or won't they roller coaster, with really equally mercurial but media-savvy leaders focusing the world's attention on the Singapore and Hanoi summits in 2018 and 2019, and much drama and calculus between those summits as well. Now, as you are all aware, President Biden began his administration almost immediately with a review of U.S. policy toward North Korea, and we expect the substantive results of that review imminently in the coming months, if not weeks. But it is not just, of course, the future direction of America's policy toward Pyongyang that will ultimately determine the fate of the peninsula and indeed the wider region. But I think what's equally important is how the president's policies are being perceived, anticipated, and ultimately reacted to by countries of the region. So, as I say today, we've gathered Stimson's brain power on Northeast Asia, the leads of our Japan, our Korea, and China programs to discuss regional perspectives on the DPRK issue. Now, I happen to think, and while I'm paid to say it, I believe it is true, that we here at Stimson really cover that region better than almost anyone, and you're about to see why I say that in the coming hour. So here's the order of battle today. I'd like to turn to each of our panelists in succession to provide just really brief introductory thoughts to really sort of set the stage for the discussion among themselves, but also really with you. Would like to follow up maybe with some clarifying questions to each of them once they finish their introductory remarks. And then we really all want to hear what you have to say and bring you into the conversation as well. And so I'd like to invite you at really any time over the course of the coming hour to put your questions into the chat. We will collect those and those questions will feature really through the discussion over the next 60 minutes. And so with that, Jenny, I'd like to maybe start with you. Jenny Town is Senior Fellow and Director of our Korea and 38 North program. Incidentally, I would commend to you Jenny's recent issue brief on the challenges of negotiating with the DPRK. We'll make it available in the chat here. And of course, it is available on the Stimson website if you care to pull it from there. Jenny, welcome. Thank you so much for doing this. And I give you the floor, ma'am.
Thanks, Brian. And it's really a pleasure to be here with my colleagues, although I wish we were in person. Hopefully we'll get back to that soon, someday this year. So I do think it's important to note that the policy review still has not been announced. It's still ongoing. There's a lot of rumors that it's near completion. But all of this then is still somewhat speculative, a lot of reactions to what people think it's going to be, a lot of concerns about what it may not be. And so I think, the messages that we've heard so far is that the policy will be centered around diplomacy with greater consultation with allies. And I think that's the most of what we've heard so far. But that's obviously a lot of broad strokes. What does diplomacy mean? Will that be top down, bottom up, or some combination thereof? Will it be multilateral or at least trilateral to include South Korea as Seoul had wanted back in 2018? Will diplomacy include summits? And what is the timeline for that? These are all questions that have no answers yet, at least to the public, for which there are proponents for all of those things among the current US government appointees working on the review. So it really could go any way, and for which the consequences will vary. But greater consultation is a welcome concept in Seoul, as there was a lot of concern in the region during the Trump years about what the US might do unilaterally that would have consequences for South Korea. But again, the question becomes, does consultation mean consensus? And so far, despite the government talking points, there does not seem to be agreement on issues such as timing, approach, or opportunity, and especially not on what South Korea could do or how to create space for it to work on that along the way. And so early signs point to the likelihood of a coordinated strategy, not a common strategy, although the degree to which that would undercut US ROC collective bargaining power is still unclear. One key issue we see playing out right now is, for instance, the US emphasis on democracy and human rights when dealing with North Korea at a time when the Moon administration is working to limit discussions on those issues to prevent them from getting in the way of negotiations. Especially in terms of inter-Korean cooperation. And so this is likely going to be a source of growing tension as South Korea has recently announced plans to impose greater restrictions on information via the Inter-Korean Exchange and Cooperation Act again. So that a lot still hangs in the balance. And I think there's also a number of lingering questions here. For instance, will the US uphold the Singapore joint statement? And what are the consequences of it not doing so? This is one of the ways in which the Biden administration could show that there can be continuity between presidential terms, which is not a good track record, that the US has not had a good track record on. But it also, if they don't uphold that, it makes it harder to reemphasize the Panmunjom Declaration and Pyongyang declarations as well. So if we want to have a greater strategy together, these kinds of signs of continuity would be very important. Where do sanctions fall and sanctions relief fall and fit into that strategy? And especially when it comes to South Korea's stalled ambition to restart inter-Korean economic projects, is there room for that in the new Biden administration strategy? In a trilateral format, there's a lot of questions about whose voice will be of greater influence on North Korea policy, South Korea or Japan. South Korea is obviously closer to the issue, but Japan's views are closer to more traditional US government approaches. And so by the US pushing Quad and trilateral cooperation, it does raise questions in South Korea as to whether its participation leads to more influence on the North Korea issue or getting lost in the mix of a more US-Japan dominated discussion. And so concerns are already rising that it's much more likely to be the latter. And then how to curb North Korea's conventional and strategic weapons development. And if there isn't an effective plan in the Biden administration, then what should South Korea do in response? There's growing support on both sides of the aisle in South Korea for South Korea crossing the nuclear threshold. And that support is likely to grow as long as policy essentially maintains the status quo. We should note also, though, that the Moon administration's approach and goals is not a consensus view in South Korea. Among Moon administration, there's a belief that North Korea is willing to denuclearize, and that the view of the future of the US-ROC alliance in terms of declining US influence in China's rise, that there's a need to maintain some strategic ambiguity. They prefer a more autonomous security arrangement, although they've already pushed back the target date of transfer for wartime operational control. And they want a Korean-led approach to the peace-building process in the region. But among conservatives, there's no belief that North Korea will denuclearize willingly. And there's little support for an interim or incremental agreement that doesn't solve the problem, but appears to tacitly accept North Korea as a nuclear armed state. And that will also erode, and then that acceptance would erode the security alliance and eventually lead to the withdrawal of troops in South Korea, of US troops in South Korea. So there's a scholar, Seokjun Yoon, with the Korea Institute for Military Affairs, who recently wrote an op-ed in The Diplomat, who stated, there may be no public disagreement revealed between the US and South Korea, but the cracks will likely grow wider and deeper as we go on. And kind of a final note, among the public, North Korea is a persistent issue. I think there's a sense that there's been too much focus on over the Moon administration at the expense of more domestic concerns, such as continued government corruption, soaring housing prices, and the crucial issue of the government's handling of COVID-19. And so while the April 2020 legislative elections were seen as a testament to the government's ability to mitigate the pandemic effectively, the recent conservative candidate wins for the mayoral elections in Seoul and Busan have been seen as an expression of deep disapproval for several of these key domestic issues, especially losing focus and losing the race on developing and or securing COVID vaccines. So what this means in the long run is that, again, there's still little consensus within South Korea about what to do about North Korea's growing conventional and strategic capabilities. But short of dramatic successes on that front in the near future, which is highly unlikely, the Moon administration and ruling party need to focus on some of these core domestic issues more effectively in the coming months if they hope to claim victory in the next presidential election in March. I'll leave it there.
Jenny, thank you very much for that intervention. Don't get too comfortable because I want to come back to you and press you a little bit and get some more color, just in terms of it, as you phrase it, this difference between a coordinated versus a common strategy, and the tensions I think embedded within that, particularly depending on how Washington views those two terms and how Seoul may view it very differently, and how they define that. But your comments also provide a very nice segue to your colleague and mine, Yuki Tatsumi. Yuki, of course, is senior fellow here at Stimson, where she both directs the Japan program and co-directs our East Asia initiative as well. Yuki Tatsumi, I give you the floor, ma'am.
Great, thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, and I'm really, really pleased to share panel with my colleagues. We never really done this before, so this is a lot of fun. I think that we would very much like to make it as a precedent. So my role is to shed a little bit light on the Japan perspective of all this, is that Japan actually was had to face many unpleasant surprises during the Trump administration when it comes to North Korea policy, and biggest of that was the President Trump's 2 times summit with Kim Jong-un, both of which really left Japan with a great sense of question that whether President Trump had really had Japan's concern also in mind when he met with the North Korean leader. And then I think many government officials and political leaders in Tokyo took a deep sense of exhale when Biden administration came on, and then I think they felt very much reassured when Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, obviously our Secretary of State and the Defense, they chose Japan and South Korea as their first foreign trip destination and having an in-person meeting, and so soon after the inauguration of the new administration. But at the same time, though, I think everybody in this audience and my colleague will notice that seems like the primary focus of these conversations, at least between Tokyo and Washington, has been very much on the China and the North Korea. Although it has been discussed, it was almost in the secondary in an order. And when Prime Minister Suga came last week to have a first in-person meeting with President Biden, very similar picture. Much of their joint statement that was released after the bilateral meeting was very much focused on China. Their concern about the free and open Indo-Pacific and the challenges that was posed by them, situation in East and South China Sea, peace and prosperity and stability of Taiwan Straits. But then they really only had like one paragraph when it came to North Korea. But what is actually really telling is, I think Jenny really hit the nail on the point on this, is that coordinated approach versus a common strategy. And then I think when it was very telling that when after the press opportunity availability for President Biden and Prime Minister Suga, when there was a question about the when there was a question about North Korea, Prime Minister Suga spoke much more at length to answer that question. And he emphasized the CVID. He emphasized the importance that Japan placed on the denuclearization of North Korea, and also resolution of abduction, which continue to come back and bite Japan in its rear when Japan tries to coordinate its policy approaches vis-a-vis North Korea. I think one issue that Japan probably will look at as a very cautious optimism is that now the Biden administration came out with a very much focus on the coordinated, at minimum, coordinated approach vis-a-vis North Korea amongst US, Japan, and South Korea, that this would indeed open the opportunity for Japan to at least start having a more normal, for the lack of better words, more normal policy consultation with Seoul, even if the scope of the discussion is very much limited to what we need to do to face North Korea together with the United States. But I will just end up with the biggest challenge for Japan is how Japan can navigate through the hamstring that they impose on themselves by putting it out there that abduction issue really needs to be solved before Japan needs to move to the next step when it comes to engagement with North Korea. And that is definitely the reason why, although former Prime Minister Abe toward the end of his term, and now Prime Minister Suga repeatedly said they are willing to meet, and they quite welcome the opportunity to sit down with Kim Jong-un without any condition. Why it hasn't happened? Because North Korea know as much as Japanese counterpart that the focus of the discussion is going to be abduction, and in North Korea's mindset, that is not going to produce any kind of a constructive, productive discussion, and it doesn't incentivize North Korea at all. So I think challenge for Japan. Of course, for Prime Minister Suga, but for his successor over the years will be how Japan can redefine the resolution of the abduction issue in a way that allows Japan to begin engagement with North Korea in a meaningful way, standing together with Japan and US in South Korea, and cooperate with China. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks so much, Yuki. I want to circle back to you as well in the Q&A here to try to get from you a little bit your read on how Tokyo is gauging sort of the relative importance that the DPRK issue is having with the Biden administration in as opposed to the previous administration. But I'd like to come back to that. But first, I want to turn last and not least to our colleague Yun Sun for some introductory thoughts as well. Yun, of course, is senior fellow and both the director of our China program here at Stimson, as well as co-director of our wider East Asia initiative as well. Yun Sun, I give you the floor, man.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for the introduction. I think this is really a terrific panel to show how much Northeast Asia focus that Stimson has, and how much expertise that our organization programs command. I'll cover how China is viewing this North Korea policy review and what are some of the Chinese calculations. I think to begin with, I think it should be pointed out that the continuity and consistency of North Korea policy by China is probably the largest among all the parties involved, because China's eventual goal or its desired endgame is fixed, and its level of acceptance of the status quo, although a very uncomfortable status quo for China, but China's level of acceptance of that status quo is still the highest among all the parties. Because for a very long time, or in the past several decades, China doesn't see itself needing to be the first mover on the issue of the Korean Peninsula. So on for example, the denuclearization issue, US and Japan, and including South Korea, has a much higher demand. And on the issue of political reconciliation and future unification, South Korea and arguably North Korea has a higher demand. So for China, what China needs to do is to wait for the situation to evolve in a direction that it wishes to see, but it also has a full capability or has a full ability to reject those changes that China doesn't want to see. So this mentality, I think, really anchors where China is currently when it looks at the policy review by the Biden administration. So on the policy review, of course, the Chinese are extremely interested. And they are interested in seeing what kind of diplomacy will be planned and what kind of, especially the easing of the sanctions that Biden administration is willing to offer, which was practically the biggest obstacle to the breakthrough of the stalemate under the Trump administration since basically the Hanoi summit. And the Chinese interest is primarily due to one change of perspective, which is that as great power competition becomes the main theme of US-China relations, the issue of North Korea has been increasingly put in or viewed in the context of the US-China competition. So on the one hand, China is keen on preventing the deterioration of the security situation on the Korean Peninsula, which will lead to the escalation of the situation in the region, and that's not in China's interest. But on the other hand, I think the Chinese are extremely interested in using or exploiting any potential diplomatic engagement between US and North Korea to create more leverage and create more bargaining power in the US-China relations. So one piece of news that was circulated very enthusiastically in China was the Biden administration had reached out to North Korea for some engagement or some conversation since its inauguration, but it has rendered no result. So there was a hope that maybe China could play the go-between and try to create try to pass on messages and create some channel of communication. And that's exactly what Beijing wants to see, making Beijing an indispensable player in what will happen between Washington and Pyongyang. Looking at the long term, since there are a lot of questions, constantly people ask that, oh, what is the possibility of cooperation between US and China on the North Korea issue? I have to say that the two great powers do not share the same strategic agendas on the Korean Peninsula. The Chinese goal is to turn the Korean Peninsula, especially South Korea, into a neutral state or preferably pro-China state, and in supportive of China's regional security or the regional leadership framework that China has about East Asia. But the US continues to hope to maintain the regional alliance system instead of transferring or handing over the regional leadership to China. So in this sense, because the strategic goals are different, it is extremely difficult for Beijing and Washington to reach a consensus over the denuclearization, especially how denuclearization should be achieved, and cooperate on that. But it doesn't mean that that there's no possibility for any cooperation on the working or tactical level. So because the Chinese are extremely, I would say the Chinese mentality is extremely transactional currently on the issue of North Korea, and they are willing to use tactical or technical cooperation on this issue to trade for, in exchange for stabilization of US-China relations. So there are some possibilities there, but we just need to have a very sober understanding about the end game of this type of transactions, because it's not going to be the full denuclearization or the full strategic outlook that Washington has in mind. I'll stop there. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you, Yun. I want to come back and press you a little bit more on that denuclearization issue, as well as get your thoughts in terms of how Beijing is measuring the calculus, but this balancing act, as you described, between Seoul and Pyongyang. But maybe before we do that, let me just encourage those of you tuning in as well to continue to feed your questions into the Q&A, and I pledge we will get to as many as we can. But Yuki, maybe we could just have a little lightning round here, some clarifying questions based upon your intervention, as well as Jenny's and Yun's. And Yuki, let me start with you and ask if you could just give us maybe a little bit more color on how you read both Tokyo and Seoul's response to the policy review itself, and what roles you believe that those two capitals really expect to play in coordination with Washington.
Thanks, Brian. I think for Japan, whatever may come out with the current Biden administration North Korea policy review, I think that maintaining the solid alliance relationship with between Japan and the U.S. and thereby maintaining, sustaining the credibility of the extended deterrent between those two countries, I think are very, very, very key for Japan. And I think in this regard, I do like to mention about the last month's Security Consultative Committee, which is the Secretary of State and Defense met with their Japanese counterparts, where they actually did talk about as one of the areas for two governments for further discussion, which is the way in which Japan continues to strengthen its own defense capability, to hold their end of the bargain, if you will, to maintain the credibility of the alliance and the deterrence of the alliance. So I think that is one role that Japan definitely expects Washington for Tokyo to play. And the other one, I think, is to be to basically, maintain the, united front, for the better words, with Washington when it comes to the engagement of North Korea. And this one, I think, is where it becomes challenging, where as the denuclearization negotiation, if they do move forward, and when they begin to talk about step-by-step approach of denuclearization of North Korea, and at one point, economic engagement with North Korea becomes the instrumental part of the steps, whether Japan can either set aside their need for the resolution of abduction issue and participate in this, whether Japan can do that or not, I think impacts greatly whether Japan can continue to play meaningful role in this process. So I think that balance, is a very delicate balance that Tokyo has to wage, but that is definitely that is definitely one issue that I think Tokyo is waiting for this North Korea review to be finished and released on.
Thank you.
And then I'm sure there will be a separate briefing with that goes on between the governments as well. So
thanks for that, Yuki. Jenny, let me go back to you. You had recently, again, highlighting the issue brief that you just published. You've called in that brief for or recommended that Biden's DPRK policy really try to empower Seoul to revive kind of inter-Korean relations. So a simple 12-part question for you, Jenny. A two-part question. I won't make it that complicated. One, does this policy review, in your view, help or hurt that goal? And second part, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the future of kind of South Korean involvement in that dialogue.
Well, I think it's good that the Biden administration is taking the time to do a policy review. A lot has changed since the Obama administration, and there is, ample reason to take stock of what worked, what didn't work under Obama's strategy, as well as how the conditions have changed and what worked and didn't work under the Trump administration. We are dealing with a very different North Korean state now. They have had some economic gains over those years. They've had major advancements in their WMD programs. And so the nature of the threat has really increased exponentially, especially over the Trump years. Maintaining the status quo is not in anyone's interest. And so there is, a definite need, especially in the region. And this is one of the things that President Moon had pushed, since the beginning of 2018, is really this need to change that status quo and move towards more of a peace regime. I think, if the policy review comes out and again creates a diplomatic strategy that is ineffective in actually engaging the North Koreans on terms that they will respond to, then we haven't really learned much over the past, several years. And it does create, quite a quandary for especially the South Koreans, as North Korea's conventional military has grown in capability as well as its strategic goals. I think one of the things that the South Koreans and a lot of us are looking for is, yes, the US and Japan just talked about the need to focus on denuclearization, but what the process has done over the past few years is really try to change that narrative to work on peace and denuclearization and normalization of relations at the same time in order to actually make progress on denuclearization, because just focusing in on the nuclear issue is one of the things that prevents us from actually gaining any ground. And so, I think the South Korean government especially is going to be very disappointed if that does become the policy, is just back to nuclear negotiations and throwing away any sort of sense of a peace process, a peace building process. If we wanted a common strategy, then we need to give South Korea some room to act. And part of that is going to be letting them move forward, providing the exemptions that they need to move forward on some of the inter-Korean economic projects to be able to make good on the commitments that they've made within the Panmunjom Declaration and the Pyongyang Declaration. But I think, short of that, it really doesn't leave South Korea a lot of space. And that's why I think you do see a lot of calls, especially among the liberals, for greater military autonomy, especially as Japan continues to build up its military. This always makes the Chinese and the Koreans very nervous. And while there's a push for the Quad and push for trilateral cooperation, the question is what does South Korea get out of that equation? So, the last time that they made a decision, an alliance decision that the Chinese didn't approve of over the deployment of THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, it led to, some crippling sanctions from the Chinese, of which the US wasn't a lot of help in resolving. And so, they look at that recent history and that recent experience and really are compelled to see both sides and maintain the strategic ambiguity because they're unsure of where they really fit in the hierarchy of the alliance system.
That is very helpful, Yun. So let's turn to you. It's a nice segue. Yun, of China, it's such a question, obviously a question mark in all of this. And while we await the release of the Biden review, we've gotten hints as to the president's future direction on the peninsula, clearly. And so I want to come back to this question of balancing and ask you if Biden's policy direction, as you intuit it, how will that impact Beijing's balancing act between Pyongyang and Seoul? And also, I wonder if you could just layer on that, what have we seen or heard from Beijing with respect to any sort of early reaction to the policy review process itself?
Thank you, Brian. Well, Beijing really has not made anything public or official statement about the policy review, but we do see the diplomatic groundwork being laid toward a more consultation or policy coordination between US and China. And one sign of that is last week, Beijing announced that they're filling the vacant position of the special envoy on Korean Peninsula affairs that had been previously empty for 2 years. So it raised the question that why is Beijing filling this important position at this time, and what kind of diplomacy they had in mind? And evidently, the desire or the message being sent is that, well, Beijing is positioning itself for either bilateral or multilateral diplomacy, and they do see that that more diplomacy and diplomatic engagement is going to come out of the Biden's policy review process. And also recently, the North Korean also replaced their top diplomat, the ambassador to China, with someone who has had tremendous foreign trade and economic background. So the message that, as people read it, is that North Korea wants to enhance its economic cooperation with China in order to stimulate its domestic growth, and China is will be very happily accommodating that position. And as a result, also it's reported that China is also planning on replacing its current ambassador in Pyongyang someone who is younger and also the deputy director of the international department of the Chinese Communist Party. So with all these personnel shifts, this younger generation and this diplomacy-oriented position, I think it's quite clear that China is gearing up for some serious diplomacy on North Korea. On the issue of balancing between North Korea and South Korea, that's a great question. Because I think as a result of Biden's policy review or his general adjustment of US policy in the region, China will enhance its policy resources and input towards both Koreas. Because for a very long time, the Chinese concern about the Korean Peninsula is that on one hand, it wants to retain North Korea as China's firm ally, but on the other hand, it also wants to peel South Korea away from the US alliance system so that the whole Korean Peninsula will be turned into what some would call a sphere of influence of China, or some would say that, well, a neutral or pro-China Korean Peninsula that will prove vital to China's regional leadership and political influence. So during the Trump era, I would say that before Singapore summit, one of the top concerns that China had was what kind of concession that Trump was going to make with North Korea that maybe will make a transaction possible. And the stalemate after the Hanoi summit proved to China that the two sides, US and North Korea, were not able, and they are not able to reach a consensus about the denuclearization and the rewards needed for the denuclearization. So I think for China, it's relatively confident that this bilateral engagement between US and North Korea is not going to render the result that Washington wants to see the most. So with North Korea relatively retained, as I think in the past 4 years, China's priority has been very much focused on how to sway South Korea's influence and alignment choices between US and China. And there has been some success. Look at South Korea's position on Quad, look at South Korea's position on the Huawei 5G issue, that even the statements after the recent 2+2 meeting, the tone of the US-South Korea statement is very different from the US-Japan statement. So I would say that for China, looking ahead, they understand that Biden will want to increase its coordination and its alignment with its regional allies, but that will put South Korea, I think, first and foremost, in a much more difficult position in its balancing act between US and China. But the bottom line is, I think from the Chinese perspective, South Korea is a US ally. So an ally is not supposed to be neutral. An ally is not supposed to be playing the balancing act. So the fact that Seoul is engaged in the balancing diplomacy and has demonstrated neutrality between US and China on various issues is already seen as a diplomatic success by Beijing. So going forward, I think Beijing will try to keep that momentum going. Thank you.
Thanks, Yun. I want to turn to questions from the audience that have been generated by your interventions, but I would be remiss if I did not, and maybe we could just do a quick lightning round across the three of you. We have not talked in any great depth here yet about the denuclearization issue, and so maybe just simply put, I wonder if you could maybe each give us a little bit of a sense as to what appetite there is in the respective countries for either multilateral, even just bilateral engagement on the denuclearization issue and kind of the wider peace process, to get to some of your earlier comments, Jenny, and see if there is there any kind of consensus across across the region in terms of who should be at the negotiating table and some of the sort of the wider issues. Jenny, maybe we could start with you.
Well, obviously in South Korea, there's high appetite for negotiations, peace negotiations, denuclearization negotiations, trying to get back as quickly as possible. You know, Moon only has, less than a year left of his term. He only has one term. And so is also trying to make momentum for his Democratic Party to be able to win in the next presidential election as well. So obviously progress on this issue, one of his legacy issues, is extremely important to him, and he wants to do whatever he can in that process to help facilitate and to help promote it along the way.
Yuki, do you want to weigh in on this question as well?
Yes, obviously, denuclearization. Japan is very much interested in that talk. But then I think this is where where it's really regrettable that the Japan and South Korea's relations are at the where they are now, because this is, I think, one area that Japan and South Korea very much share their concerns that what often described a small deal, which just focuses on nuclear warheads, is not going to be good enough neither for Tokyo nor Seoul. So this is one area I think their interests converge. And so that's why I think it should be multilateral. But then I think that is why I think Japan and South Korea really needs to get their relations back on track.
So Yoon-Suk, are you going to spoil the party for us? What's the view from Beijing, you think?
Of course I will. I think for China, while both bilateral and multilateral are indispensable for the process or for the issue to be resolved, because you often hear the Chinese will say that, oh well, for us to have really an answer to the denuclearization question, the first question that needs to be addressed is that US and North Korea need to come together and have a consensus about their security arrangement. So without these two parties resolving their fundamental differences over, for example, the national security of North Korea, the security threat that North Korea feels from the United States, there's not going to be even a beginning for the multilateral negotiation. But I think the other side that the Chinese really do not mention is that although they want US and North Korea to first start conversation to resolve that fundamental roadblock, the Chinese will say, we never said that any agreement or any arrangement regarding the future of the Korean Peninsula could be reached without the Chinese participation. So I think from the Chinese perspective, they probably envision a multi-phased process that it will first between US and North Korea, and then moving on to a multilateral setting that at least will involve the two Koreas and US and China, and potentially with involvement from Russia and Japan as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you for that. So I want to turn to, with your permission, some questions that are coming in from our participants as well. And Jenny, maybe I could turn to you first for a question related to domestic politics in the South. Of course, there is an election, as you pointed out, coming up in the not too distant future in Seoul, and I wonder if you could say a few words about how that upcoming election will likely impact South Korea's approach to the North and to the U.S. on this issue.
I think it's important to look at what happened with the mayoral elections. And so the conservative candidates had a overwhelming win, a rather unexpected overwhelming win. And a lot of it, again, like I said, was driven by domestic concerns, especially on COVID handling, and a number of things that were on Moon's domestic platform from the beginning that have not been addressed. Or have not improved during his term. And I do think that this was a big wake-up call to the Democratic Party, as this was seen largely not as a win by the conservatives, but by a major loss by the Democratic Party. They've lost the faith of the people. They've lost all the support that they had before, especially among their main demographic groups. And I do think that this then does require the Moon administration and the Democratic Party, if they want to be a more viable candidate for the presidential elections, to really turn to some of those domestic issues and really put that effort back into that, where then North Korea, especially, again, since it's very unlikely that we're getting major breakthroughs in the meantime that are going to pull focus from the domestic situation, I think it means that there's going to have to be a sort of a lightening up, a setting aside the North Korea issue to some degree, especially since the North Koreans are not being cooperative in the process, and really refocusing attention on dealing with the domestic issues, as well as the relationship with the United States. I think one point of contention that's going to come up, and that has started to come up, and I think is going to grow, and deals with trilateral cooperation as well, is Japan's decision to expunge the wastewater, the the contaminated wastewater from Fukushima into the ocean. And the US is not objecting to this. And so obviously South Korea and China are. And this is going to be a point of growing contention, in the coming months. And I think will play a role in the elections as well. But, in terms of some of the other alliance issues, US-ROC alliance issues, it's good that we got the cost sharing agreement out of the way. I don't think it was exactly, I don't think the South Koreans were exactly happy with it, but it is a sort of relief to get at least that out of the way and start working towards better cooperation. They've already moved OPCON transfer, past the presidential election. It's not going to get done in time. And so there's a lot of these issues that, Moon really wanted to make progress on that he's not going to. So in order to build momentum for his party, he's really going to have to make some big successes on some of those domestic issues before the next election cycle.
So Yuki, let's turn back to Tokyo for a moment. Prime Minister Suga, of course, has expressed his readiness to meet with Kim Jong-un, as you referenced previously. If this plan were to go forward, let's just cast the future for us. If this plan were to go forward, and if it did have President Biden's backing, what can we expect from that type of engagement?
Thank you, Brian. I do think that it is really depends on whether if that summit, let's say, happens, by that time, whether Japan will have been able to come up with the alternative path forward when it comes to abduction. Because as long as the first issue that Japanese side, even if they said they are willing to sit down with Kim Jong-un without precondition, North Korea knows that that is Tokyo's first priority. And Prime Minister, not just Abe, but then Suga also said so in their respective policy speech domestically. So whether Japan can create the alternative approach to this, or basically exit way out of the own parameter that it's set on its own, to have a conversation at the same time, continue to pursue the resolution of this issue. Even if the summit were to occur, I really don't think the conversation between the two leaders will be anything too much more than a pro forma exchange of their respective talking points. And let's promise to meet again when it makes sense for both of us to do so kind of ending. So I think it's really up to, primarily up to Tokyo, whether they can come up with that alternative approach. But then at the same time, whether North Korea can also come up with a new approach when it comes to their stance toward the abduction from the past. So I think both sides has to give a little and step away from their current course a little. But for both countries, for domestic political leaders, that I think probably much more so in Japan, it's much harder to deviate from the position that they had already created like 10 years, some 20 years ago, and basically has stayed there since then.
Thanks for that, Yuki. So Yun, let me bring you back down to a very tactical level. And we've had some questions coming in terms of cross-border trade. And I wonder if a two-part question, if you could say a few words about kind of what is the future of cross-border trade and sanctions enforcement in the Chinese context, and then maybe layered upon that, just in terms of kind of China's influence or pressure on the North. What are the obstacles that are preventing China from exerting greater pressure on the North, given their extensive trade ties?
Thank you, Brian. I think it's widely observed that China's implementation of the UN Security Council sanctions has been visibly loosened since 2018, including the illegal trade through the border black market, the sales, especially the ship-to-ship transfer of gas and diesel on the sea, as well as the Chinese illegal fishing rights in the North Korean waters, based on the fishing rights that they purchased from the North Korean side in 2018 and 2019. So all of these are against UN sanction resolutions. Especially on the illegal fishing issue, Stimson organized another panel last September to specifically talk about what has happened, and the evidence is solid. There's no deniability. So these illegal transactions are not officially sanctioned by Beijing, but it does offer Beijing deniability. But I think it is also fair to say that the Chinese authority did not crack down on them either. So, for example, the public promotion of fishing rights in North Korean waters in the Chinese social media is politically unthinkable if Beijing had pursued a tighter implementation regime. But I think what this has reflected is a mentality in China that somehow North Korea's good behavior, quote unquote, which is moratorium of its nuclear test and this ICBM test, since the Trump administration should be rewarded. And I think the Chinese feel sympathetic that the North Korean good behavior has not received any easing of the sanction, either by the UN or by the United States, which is why that you saw that China and Russia jointly advocated publicly for the easing of UN sanctions in late 2019. So I think today, even as of today, the Chinese belief remains that North Korea is owed reciprocity by the international community, especially the United States, for the provocations it did not engage in. So the loose implementation of the sanctions reflects the Chinese sympathy of the North Korean demand for reciprocity, as well as Beijing's frustration with the Trump administration over the deterioration of U.S.-China relations. But then, of course, 2020 was also a very special year because of the pandemic. North Korea closed its border. So not only the official transactions, the official trade, but also the unofficial or the illegal trade across the border had been affected by that. And that has created tremendous economic difficulty in North Korea. So as North Korea tries to reopen its country and tries to reinvigorate its domestic economic growth, I think the China factor is going to be even a bigger consideration in the North Korean calculus. Thank you.
Thanks, Yun. Jenny, let me bring you back in and ask you. You referenced to the upcoming summit with President Moon. So we've seen what happened with Prime Minister Suga, and I wonder if you were advising President Moon today. What is the one thing that you would be counseling him to be pressing the Biden administration on? What is the top priority for Seoul coming into and out of the pending summit?
Good question. You know, I think a lot of the emphasis has to be on I think there has to be some recognition in the U.S. of some give and take here. So, you know, yes, the U.S. wants South Korea to be more embedded in trilateral cooperation and Quad cooperation in the alliance. I think there's been plenty of communication across the way to say that, you know, that this puts South Korea in a very difficult position, and I think you have seen some of the U.S. language change a little bit accordingly in terms of the Indo-Pacific region instead of the Indo-Pacific strategy and little tweaks like that. But I think there does need to be a little more push on, if we do this, one, we need greater protections against Chinese coercion, especially Chinese economic coercion. I know that's one of the topics that is coming up as to how to get into US semiconductor supply chain. And so what other kinds of protections can the US offer to help South Korea make those choices with greater confidence that they aren't going to get, that it isn't going to backfire on them, and that they'll be left in the lurch to deal with these issues on their own?
Yuki, I want to pick up on something you had referenced a little earlier, and it's this around the question of human rights. So I think it is safe to say that Tokyo had some appreciation for the Trump administration's handling of the DPRK issue, and that it elevated the nuclear issue, certainly, in new and unique ways. How would Tokyo, in your view, likely respond to a Biden administration policy that shifts to one that is more focused on human rights than some of the traditional issues that have really dominated the negotiating position for Washington?
I honestly think that will create major complication for Japan. Because Japan is happily having a U.S. that focuses on nuclear, it's a negotiation with North Korea that focuses on the nuclear and other conventional weapon capabilities and how to curtail and contain those capabilities. Although the human rights issue may have some resonance in terms of you can redefine the resolution of abduction issues, certainly in that term as well. But then that also then opens the door, put Japan in a very awkward position on some of the other human rights issues around other parts of the world. Like Japan is one of the few countries that have not put, sanctions on China on these human rights issues that other G7 countries have already placed sanction on. So for Japan, focused on human rights, put Japan on the awkward position of having to make the call on the issues that Tokyo has been kind of avoiding to make on the other ledger of the human rights problem. So it may have some benefits to it in sense of it allows Japan also to redefine the abduction issue in those terms somehow, but it also definitely brings the complication for Tokyo.
So Yun, maybe a final question to you as we press up against the clock here. Yuki mentioned earlier, and I quite agree with her, that in relative terms, there is a sense, at least here in Washington, that the relative priority of the Korea issue has somewhat dropped for the administration. Not because I would suggest that they find it unimportant, but the competition with other issues, be it COVID, be it trade, and other issues, particularly in the region, are competing with the DPRK issue. So if we have that sense from Washington, and I wonder if we could ask you to try to put yourself in the shoes of Beijing, and let me ask you this: where does the DPRK issue rank among the priority agenda items for Beijing in the wider U.S.-China relationship?
Thank you, Brian. That is a terrific question. So I remember when the Biden administration first inaugurated, I was in a track 2 dialogue, and we were talking with the Chinese side about Biden's foreign policy priority and where North Korea really fit. And I think the conclusion or the consensus, well, probably not top 5, maybe not even top 7. Whether it's top 10 is subject to debate. So we're seeing Iran, we're seeing Afghanistan, we're seeing China, Taiwan, South China Sea, all these issues being the competing priorities for the Biden administration. Then it gets to the question as for where DPRK really lands on China's priority list. Like I mentioned from the very beginning, China doesn't see itself as a first mover. It's okay. It's not comfortable with the status quo, but it finds the status quo to be an okay state for China to live with. So in the Chinese calculation, if there are countries who are not okay with the DPRK current situation, it's the United States, it's Japan, and it's South Korea. And if these countries really want to change what's going on with the North Korea process, then they need to make an offer to China that China can aspire to. So in that sense, I cannot emphasize this enough, that China doesn't see itself as a first mover on the Korean Peninsula, and it can't afford to be the second mover. And so what does that mean is that I think China needs to guard against one scenario, which is that the Biden administration somehow returns to a strategic patience approach and put North Korea not only not a priority, but also on the shelf, because that's almost a guaranteed formula to invite North Korean provocation, because North Korea will want to get the U.S. attention and get U.S. to act and engage again. So with North Korean provocation, it not only buries a future possibility of engagement, of diplomacy, it also will immediately enhance the military pressure on China in the Northeast Asia region. And we have seen this evolving in the past decade or the past 2 decades, that whenever there's a crisis on the Korean Peninsula, the Chinese are first angry about how U.S. is enhancing or strengthening a security presence in the region for a very good reason. So I think that's one scenario that the Chinese definitely does not want to see and will guard against. But other than that, if the Biden approach is primarily centered on diplomacy, then the Chinese will be very happy to play along. Thank you.
Thank you, Yun. So this conversation could clearly have gone on for another hour without breaking a sweat. And I want to thank all three of my colleagues, Yuki Tatsumi, Yun Sun, and Jenny Town for participating. They are available to you always. Their work is available on our Stimson website. You can see the address behind me. I encourage you to go on and check out their work regularly. I really hope that, as Yuki mentioned at the outset, that we can make this a series and really capitalize on the remarkable talent that we have here at the Stimson Center. I want to thank you all for participating with us today, and we really look forward to getting you back on and connecting